Sikkim 365 and Baylor Plus have teamed up to bring Baylor fans the ultimate content bundle. You can sign up now for $17.99 a month, a $5 monthly savings, and get instant access to all premium content on both websites. For more information, visit either sikkim365.com or baylorplus.com today. What's up, Baylor family? Welcome into Inside Baylor Sports, the official daily podcast of Baylor Athletics. It's Tuesday, October 1st, and Grace and I are here with you today to preview Baylor's road contest against number 16 Iowa State. It's Baylor's third game against a ranked opponent this season, second road game against a ranked opponent. The Bears face number 11 Utah on the road in the second week of the season. And then just last week faced number 22 BYU at home. Also worth noting that Colorado received a few votes in the AP and coaches poll after their thumping of UCF over the weekend. Man, Grayson, it's just like the start of the season is when you're a team that's looking to get on track and get some confidence built. This is not what you were expecting at the beginning of the season with BYU and Colorado specifically. And now obviously with Iowa State, kind of anticipating them to be a solid team this year. But it's just another test to kind of measuring stick for Baylor, and this time on the road. It's just Baylor actually won the last time they were in Ames. I believe that was in 2022. Actually had a really solid performance in that game, played well defensively, got enough offensively, and that was right before Baylor's struggles began that have led us until this moment. So you would hope that Baylor can play a pretty strong game this weekend, but it's going to be a challenge against Matt Campbell's Cyclones, because they're always reliable defensively. They're going to be physical offensively, and they're going to make you beat them in every facet of the game.
You mentioned the game in 2022, and that was kind of one of those games where it was like, oh, these two programs are kind of trending in different directions, because Iowa State had a really bad 2022 season, but of course they bounced back in 2023. Were much better, especially to close that season. And then this year, they're off to a great start. You know, for them, it's always great when you can avoid losing to Iowa, because it doesn't happen all that often. And it really, I think in past years, that Iowa loss has really set them back from a record standpoint, just kind of losing that game so often. It gives you a 2-1 non-conference slate. So they avoided that this year in a crazy game. And now they're sitting here ranked nearly inside the top 15, and very deservedly so. Pretty much every metric you look at has Iowa State inside the top 2 or 3 in the conference right now, which makes a lot of sense just because they're so steady on offense. They have some playmakers, but they're really just steady. They take care of the football. They know who they are. And then defensively, I mean, they've been good. I mean, pretty much ever since Matt Campbell got there, and that's just kind of continued.
Yeah. I think Dave Aranda mentioned it in his press conference today. They're going to make you convert on long drives defensively, and then offensively they want to slow the game down. So these games have the potential of being very short if you're not careful, and that can be a good or bad thing depending on how efficient your team is. And right now Baylor's not exactly efficient on either side of the ball. We saw the struggles defensively in the first half against BYU. We know what the offense has faced. So I'm really curious, because this Iowa State offense, like, you look at the statistics, you just look at the raw statistics, there's nothing that blows you away. Then you watch them on film, and it's like consistently converting third downs. They're always in good positions. They're going to be reliable special teams, and then they win. They shut out Houston just last week, which is not a great feat by any means, but it kind of just, it's slow and steady wins the race. I mean, that game was like 6-0 late into the third quarter. They end up pulling away late. I would say give Houston credit. I think they have a pretty solid defensive unit this year. We saw them play well against Oklahoma, but overall, is just a team that is not going to beat you with flash. It's a lot different than Colorado. I say very similar in ways to BYU. They've just been doing it for a long time. They've just been consistent doing it, and they have a quarterback on the offensive side of the ball in Rocco Beck who is just pretty steady. He's not going to have the big turnover. He does a good job with the quarterback run game. And man, it's just a tough team to beat, especially when you talk about a night environment on the road in Ames at that stadium. Baylor fans know how much in getting a win, or how difficult getting a win up there is, throwing the fact that it's a night game. At least this game isn't in November when it's freezing cold outside, but it's a challenge nonetheless.
It definitely is. And I think the thing that Iowa State does really well is they put their opponents in very uncomfortable situations. And that is kind of the thing that gives me the most pause going into this game is I think there's a real chance that Baylor's in some really uncomfortable situations and they got to figure out a way to execute, offensively and defensively. And Aranda mentioned in the press conference just talking about how, they're going to have things schemed up specifically for Baylor. And Baylor's going to have to be able to diagnose those, see what's happening, and execute. And in their base formations, which they did not do against BYU, especially in the first half. And so, it's a real challenge. It's going to be, it's going to take a lot for Baylor to win this game. I think of the slate so far, the games that they've played, I know Colorado looks better now. We'll see how that kind of translates. But I do think going on the road to Utah and this one against Iowa State are probably the two most challenging games that Baylor's faced so far this season.
Yeah, I mean, getting 3 road games under your belt, the atmosphere at Colorado was strong. I mean, it was an involved crowd. Obviously, their first ever Big 12, or not first ever Big 12 game, but first since returning to the Big 12. So there's not going to be anything that Baylor hasn't necessarily seen. I think they've seen strong crowds. Iowa State fans are going to be juiced up for that one, but at least Baylor's played under the lights. They've played in some bad weather. Not that it's going to be bad weather on Saturday in Ames, but generally, like they're mentally, there's not going to be anything that they haven't seen this season, which is a positive. And you have to have that, especially for a team trying to find its way. So is there any other takeaways from Dave Aranda's press conference today that you want to mention? No, we'll touch on all the guys coming back potentially this week, but anything else that he mentioned that really stood out to you? I know you did the updates on him earlier today.
I think the biggest thing was definitely the injury updates. I think that was probably the biggest factor. So we'll talk about that. I would say that, he mentioned, and this is just so interesting to me, that this keeps, coming up. And so I'm curious, kind of, does that lead to wins, which is momentum of the program, belief from the players, guys feeling really disappointed about how the results have ended up so far because they feel like they're a very talented team and can win games going forward. And so, I mean, if that belief is actually there, if that is the truth that's coming out, that these guys really believe in it, they're 100% bought in, that, they're going to be able to, come out and they really want to win games, they really want to win this game, then I think it does speak well to maybe how they'll respond the rest of the season. Because I think where we're at right now is, at what point do you get to where you're like, oh man, I'm worried this team might give up. You know what I mean? And it doesn't feel like they're at that point right now. Dave Aranda's been very open and honest about that. He feels like there's momentum this week with getting all these guys back and just a good environment, I think, for the team right now. That could be coach speak, but I think just based on what he said, the way he said it, I think it does provide a little bit of optimism as they reach this, tough 2 road game with a buy-in between stretch where they really need to find themselves.
Yeah, I'm interested to see how this team responds on the road. I mean, believe it or not, I think this team over the last 2 seasons has played more together on the road. I don't know if that's just a tendency to get home and relax a little bit, but the performances that they had on the road, I mean, they've had their issues on the road too, but you talk about wins, you talk about the loss at Colorado where they played pretty well, pretty steady throughout the game. Then at home, there's just these collapses of not being able to put it all together early in the games or something happens late. So I'm anxious to see how the team responds on the road at Iowa State mentally. And let's talk on the guys coming back. I don't know if it was, you don't want to talk about these potential outings or these guys being out as a big issue for the BYU game. But man, I think it's kind of being under discussed in a lot of ways because you're talking about several key players and now they're back. You talk about Garmin Randolph, Steve Linton specifically on the edge positions. We are not really sure. I think we've kind of come to the conclusion that we don't know on Caden Jenkins, despite what was said in the press conference today on Monday. But overall, like, you get guys back in the interior part of your defense that you're going to need against Iowa State. They're gonna want to punish you in the run game. Those 2 guys specifically coming back seem to be the most likely to help this team on the road against Iowa State specifically.
I agree with you. I also think it's important to mention this was Cooper Lands' first game back. So you're talking about a guy that's going to get better as he gets further away from his ankle injury that he suffered a little bit earlier in the season. So that's huge as well. I would say that, yes, Steve Linton, Garmin Randolph, getting them back would be huge. I don't really know what happened with Jacquez Evans because he did not play in the game, but was stressed out. So, what's going on there? I felt like he played okay against Colorado. They could have used him against BYU, to be honest. And so, getting those guys back, I think, again, Carl Williams looks like a guy that, again, I think he's going to get healthier as the season progresses. He had to come out a few times, looked like he was limping a few times. So hopefully he gets closer to 100%. Cornerback, we're still kind of trying to figure out what's going to happen there. Lorando left the game early. Caden Jenkins didn't play. Tevin Williams still has a huge wrap on his hand. Chateau Reed didn't play in the game. It's really like Reggie Bush and LeVar Thornton are the only two for sure's right now. And so that's a little troubling. But I think in general, they're kind of at a position where, okay, they get these guys back. Can they turn the corner? Did these young guys get some confidence? The guys that were backing them up did, especially in that second half, and can they kind of regroup? That's big. And then, of course, getting Campbell Barrington back on offense is huge because, frankly, they haven't been good enough at left tackle all year. So having to not have Caden Siraki be able to rotate in at left tackle was really tough. They really need to have options at left tackle, and they didn't in this game because Campbell wasn't there to anchor the right side. So that will be huge in this one because Iowa State can get after the quarterback, and they're going to try to make life hard for Sawyer Robertson in the pocket.
Yeah, Sidney Fugar played left tackle, I think 40 snaps, and that's not something he has done at Baylor yet. So obviously they're getting him reps there as a transfer from South Carolina. He played a little bit of tackle there, but hasn't done it at Baylor. He was expected to be a guard, so they needed him to play there. So Campbell coming back is massive. Michael Trigg's going to be back, according to Dave Aranda, which to me was in that BYU game specifically, he was going to be a focal point in offense, and then he's out, suspended for that game. Could have been very valuable instead of having to put a guy out there in Gavin Yates who's not used to line up in the slot, being prioritized in the pass game. So that's going to be something interesting to watch because if you're struggling to run the ball against Iowa State, kind of one of those options that you can do is split guys out and spread them out. And Michael Trigg creates mismatch problems, especially if you look at Iowa State's linebackers, who I would say overall it can comparatively to where they have been in the past are kind of the weakness of their defense right now. I think they have a solid defensive front. The linebackers are just they're just not up to the pedigree as they typically are at Iowa State, I would say. I think they've had issues with injuries there as well. I know that another guy's supposed to be out for a little while that got hurt against Houston. Chance Bacon, I believe is his name. It might not be. I know it's Bacon. I can't remember his first name, and I'm sorry. I apologize to any Iowa State fans listening to this, but that was kind of their guy at linebacker going into the season. He gets hurt. I think the first game of the season has been out. So I think there's some concerns there. And if you have a guy like Michael Trigg that can go in and take advantage of that. Now, they do run a 3 safety. If Baylor fans remember the Matt Rule defense here, very similar. 3 down linemen, 3 interior linebackers, 3 essentially deep safeties. They all kind of have different roles. But that tight end position can be one that can be taken advantage of on this defense. And I'm interested to see with Michael Trigg coming back, how he can be utilized.
I agree. I mean, he's been a mismatch problem, I think, all year. They have an ability with him to create explosive plays, to get first downs. I mean, he's a really good player, and they missed him last week. They could have used him against BYU, but, things happen. So he didn't play, and they needed kind of a next man up. And unfortunately, Kelsey Johnson wasn't available either. So kind of in a situation where you're just kind of rolling with the next man, and that's fine. But it's also tough to be losing, 2 key guys like that in Trigg, especially in the pass game. I will say, we kind of mentioned, I mentioned Campbell Barrington, but man, that they got to figure out something at left tackle. And it's so hard because, and Aranda's mentioned this, you're basically making the choice of, do you want to run the ball more effectively without Alvin Ebasele, or do you want to pass block more effectively with Caden Siraki? And I think going forward, it feels like this team is kind of going to have to be pass heavy. And so I think you're probably going to see Caden Siraki play a lot of left tackle with Campbell Barrington at right tackle. You mentioned Sidney Fugar. He is the second lowest graded offensive lineman on this team in run block and pass block. So I don't think he's a tackle. I think he's a guard. And so he's kind of having to play out of position just to try to give them some reps. So it's been tough there. And I think that's what makes Michael Trigg so important for this offense, because when you have to go pass heavy, you need a bunch of pass catchers out there. And Trig provides that, especially in these 4 wide receiver sets where they like having a tight end on the field instead of 4 wide receivers for the most part. And so that's kind of made things a little bit difficult. And I'm curious how they adjust, because it does feel like some teams will be able to run on Iowa State pretty effectively. I don't know if Baylor's that team. And the problem is that Iowa State's strength is in their secondary. Their 3 safeties are awesome. I mean, they are. Jeremiah Cooper probably should have been a Baylor guy. I mean, Baylor recruited him really hard and then kind of backed off at the end, and he ends up at Iowa State. And now he's a superstar for them. A turnover creating machine. Malik Verdon is their other really good safety back there. And then Bo Frailer is kind of the guy that's going to get more in the box and is kind of your de facto linebacker type. He leads the team in tackles. Awesome player. Like, those 3 guys are spectacular. And then at cornerback, they're really good. I think their highest graded player is one of their cornerbacks, actually, in Darian Porter. And so it's a lot to deal with back there. It's going to be hard to consistently drop back and try to throw the ball. Baylor threw the ball, I think, 47 times against BYU. I think if they do that in this game, it's kind of going to be a recipe for disaster. They do need to be able to run it some, I think, in Ames.
Yeah, they're going to try to. The script's kind of flipped against BYU versus what they've been doing in the previous games. You talk about running basically 60 to 65% of the time. BYU game, threw it 47, 48 times, ran it 28 times. A lot of those were with Sawyer Robertson. And that's one area I want to talk about. And if you go through and look at the statistics for Iowa State's defense, the outside of the Iowa game, quarterback run has been an area where Iowa State's a little bit vulnerable. It's not huge gashing runs by any means, but it's consistent. I think that aligns with Baylor's strength in running the ball with Sawyer Robertson. Now, Dave Aranda mentioned it, like, you get hit and it becomes an issue. You start getting injured, it becomes an issue. Sawyer has to be careful, but there is some opportunity there to kind of spread guys out and maybe run it. We've seen Sawyer have 2 big runs this season, the one against BYU, one against Colorado, where he's a guy back there and he basically zone reads the defense and takes off. So that's a strength of him that could open up the run game a little bit. When you're talking about yards per carry averages, the running backs are going to struggle to do it overall. When it's a design run to the running backs, they're going to struggle at times because the run blocking is just not a strong suit. But if you look at what Sawyer can do to kind of offset that, they have to find enough on the ground, specifically in the game against Iowa State, to keep that defense honest. And one thing I'm really curious to see in the run game, and I think it kind of came to fruition against BYU, is Bryson Washington getting the majority of the snaps, but he's a good pass catcher. And not that the other guys aren't, but we saw him have a terrific catch on the sideline. And if there's ways to get a guy like Bryson Washington the ball, it might be in the pass game, even in the screen game. And that's something we haven't necessarily seen this year with this particular team, of true traditional screens to running backs. Maybe it's not a strength of the offensive line, and that's a concern, but that could be something we could see with Bryson Washington specifically in this game.
I could see that for sure. Just trying to get him the ball on the outside instead of just running it up right up the middle, because they just haven't had a lot of success there. And, BYU, frankly, not great at stopping the run. They're fine, but they're not elite at it. I mean, I think Kansas State ran for like 230 yards on them the week before, and then they show up in Waco and Baylor can't run the ball at all. And so that does make you kind of sit back and go, okay, well, maybe Iowa State's not elite at stopping the run, as, some teams have ran on them. Iowa ran for 204 yards, but that was their lowest output of the season so far. So that was actually a pretty good performance. Houston ran for 169 yards, 5.5 yards per carry. They just couldn't throw the ball at all. They only threw the ball for 72 yards. And then North Dakota ran for 174 yards on them, but they're a really good running football team. And so it just kind of leads you back to the point of, Iowa State may not be elite at stopping the run. This might not be their best run defense ever. But the thing of it is that still might be good enough to where they're shutting down Baylor's run game. Maybe not completely, but it feels like this is not, it feels like this should be a matchup they can take advantage of, but I'm not confident that they will at this point. I do think it's going to be important for Sawyer to run the football. It's going to be important for them to stay ahead of the chains, but they're going to have to take a huge step forward if they're going to not be able to run the ball against BYU, but then show up in Ames and really put together a really good rushing performance. I think they're probably going to need to have similar outputs to what they did against Colorado, probably, to win this game, running the ball. And we'll see if they can get there.
Yeah, and statistically, I would say BYU, Iowa State, Colorado are all very similar statistically. Now they haven't played the same opponent, so it makes it a little variance there, but they're very similar. And Iowa State, I would think going into this game, now we'll see what the defensive game plan can change any for Iowa State because of the way Baylor threw the football against BYU, against a passing defense that came into that game that hadn't allowed a passing touchdown the entire season. BYU, Baylor had 3 of them and moved the ball pretty consistently through the air. Then it goes back to pass protection and all that. So there's a lot of challenges for Baylor in this game. But advantage-wise, do you see anything that really stands out to you that Baylor could have some advantage to take advantage of just offensively or defensively in this game particularly that they need to capitalize on?
I think that Baylor has an opportunity to really slow down Iowa State on offense. I think that's the area that I feel like if Baylor plays like they did in the second half against BYU, if they play like they have for most of the season, as Dave Aranda said, they have not put together 4 quarters. They haven't. They've given up explosive plays. They did it early against Utah and then settled in. Can they come out ready to go and prepared? And those first couple drives that are scripted, can Baylor get off field and get stops? That's going to be really important for them to get off to a fast start. But yeah, Iowa State's offensive line, it's fine. It's not great. I don't think they're going to bully people more times than not. I don't really see that happening. Now they do have 3 really good running backs, including Abu Sama, who is very tough to bring down. And if Baylor isn't ready for that, he'll create explosive plays. I mean, he's averaging 5.6 yards per carry. So you're going to have to slow that down. But I do think Baylor is kind of set up to do that. I think the linebacker play, the defensive line should give them opportunities. I think in the pass game, Iowa State has 3 guys. They're really, really good. Jaden Higgins and Jalen Noel stand out there. They're going to be really tough to defend in that regard. But I do think if you can get pressure on Rocco Becht and force him to kind of be perfect in those situations where you're getting pressure on him, I think you can have some success there, or at least keep them behind the chains, force them to convert 3rd and 5 instead of 3rd and 2. And that would be key for Baylor in this one. So I feel pretty good about that. I don't think Iowa State's scoring 30 on Baylor, or at least they shouldn't. Baylor should not be allowing that. And then it comes down to, on the other side, can Baylor have any success on offense? Because the problem is I don't really see an area that Baylor is like, oh yeah, they're for sure going to be able to do this against Iowa State. It's going to have to be individual wins, especially in the passing game, that I think ultimately moves this team. And based on what we've seen so far, it's very hard to have confidence that they're going to be able to do that and sustain that for an entire 4 quarters.
Yeah, I think you look at their offensive line currently, yards per carry, they rank 8th in the Big 12 at 4.79 yards per carry on offense, yards per pass, 6.36. If you watch their games, they're not, they do. Last year, they showed a tendency of attacking vertically more. So maybe it's just game planning, matchups. Maybe in this game, they turn around and throw the ball vertically a ton. It looks like what they want to do is extend their drives, be consistent, be efficient, shorten the games, at least early in the season. You mentioned finding an area where Baylor does have an advantage. One thing I really found fascinating, and I know that statistically their defense, passing defense, is really good, but they actually rank 13th in the Big 12 in 30-yard pass plays giving up, 30-plus yards pass plays given up, which was really intriguing because I feel like Sawyer in this offense, since Sawyer's taken over, has found those abilities to get those longer passing plays. As a team, they rank 7th in the Big 12 with 6 of them. I feel like majority of those have been with Sawyer. I think maybe DeQuan Finn had 1 of them. So I don't know if there's something to that. I know if you look at the opponents they played with Iowa, obviously last week against Houston, that's not those 2 teams' games right now. So maybe there is something there, some vulnerabilities there that Baylor can attack. I don't know, if it translates into anything. Maybe they just completely scheme away from it. So that's the only hole that I really say, oh yeah, Baylor could have an advantage there. And then the yards per carry, Baylor's averaging 3.85. They're giving up 4.18. Neither one of them are very good. They're both in the lower third of the Big 12 this year, but it all goes back to opponent and who they face. So I don't see any direct advantages for Baylor in this particular game offensively. They're going to have to create their advantages and do some things, be opportunistic, maybe hopefully get some turnovers with short fields. But I'm with you defensively. I think that this particular group, the group that went on the field against BYU, is not the same defense as what Baylor can put on. You talk about Garmin Randolph, Steve Linton being out, your top 3 cornerbacks being out. They could all very well be out again this week, and we'll be having the same conversation. But those guys coming back changes the dynamic of Baylor's defense entirely. I think Baylor's opportunity to win is slowing down Iowa State's offense even more than they want to slow it down. If you can make this a game where your offense only needs to score 17 points, ideally, that's what you want to do. Then you figure out, okay, where do we get 17 points from? And we can look at special teams. I think Baylor has a pretty good advantage in special teams in this game. And maybe that's where that next level of Baylor can figure out how to win if their special teams perform again.
I mean, I would agree with that, but the problem is they haven't kicked field goals very well, and that's continuing to show up. Dave Aranda mentioned that in the press conference, so you're going to have to be sharp in that area on the road in a night game at Ames. So I'm curious about that. That was an interesting stat you said about explosive plays in the pass game, because Iowa State only gives up like 103 pass yards per game and 49% completion percentage. So, I mean, you're talking about pretty much all the yards they've given up this year have just been explosive plays.
And I haven't seen the film of those explosive plays. There's not a ton of them, but you're talking about a ratio of, if you've given up 4 pass plays of 30 plus yards, well, 4 completions on the amount of completions they have given up aren't very many. I don't know which games they were in, the circumstances they were in. I just know the statistics. So I don't know if that translates into anything, but it is there. There's a potential for something to happen there, potentially with Baylor's offense, kind of aligning with what Baylor's strengths are right now on offense.
Right. I think that will require Baylor to run the football, though. That's kind of what Iowa State has really forced teams to do, is prove you can run it. And then if you prove you can run it now, okay, you might have to commit more guys into the box. And that's probably, that's kind of where you're seeing those explosive numbers jump, because typically Iowa State, they're trying to keep everything in front of them, force you to have these long, sustained drives. And most times those don't really work out in the long run. And that won't really work out for Baylor. I think Baylor does have to hit some explosive, some big plays, and not get caught in a situation where they're having to run, 12, 13, 14 plays to score a touchdown. That's just a really tough position to be in. I do think that a key to this game, and it's something that we've mentioned for a while because it's a key in most games, but Baylor's got to start fast. Like if you get down 10-0 or you get down 17-7 on the road in Ames, it's going to be really tough to come back, because they will sit on the football. They will just get first downs. They'll be perfectly content with keeping things in front of them, making you be perfect. So getting out to an early lead, getting out to a 10-7 or a 17-7 type of lead would be huge for Baylor to just have some confidence and belief in themselves, and just really keep them ahead of the chain, so to speak, when referring to the entire game. Like, you got to stay ahead of the change, just not allowing Iowa State to be in a place where they're ultra comfortable at home, just sitting on the football and taking the air out of the game, because that's what they want to do. They want to suffocate you. And that's kind of what Aranda mentioned in the press conference. They just want to choke you out. And that's it. That's what they want to do the whole game. That's what they're going to try to do, try to get a lead and then sit on it, and then make you make the mistakes to try to come back in the game.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And you talked about grinding it out. Another kind of interesting stat here. Baylor's defense has given up 17 plays of 20 plus yards, which ranks 6th, but Iowa State's offense has only generated 18 of those, which ranks 14th in the Big 12. So like they're not looking to just, like, they're comfortable in just saying, hey, we're just gonna give our running backs the ball, get them 3 yards, complete some passes to our tight ends and our 2 really good receivers, and just move the chains and extend plays. So if Baylor overcompensates for that, Iowa State could come out, attack them early, and get deep. I think this might be a game where Baylor just says, hey, we're not going to let you crush us like BYU did early and get some explosive plays. And I think that you can credit some of that to guys being out. But I think game plan-wise, I think it altered us a little bit as well. So Baylor going on the road can allow Iowa State to get explosive plays when they haven't tried to get them at all this season till this point. So it should be fascinating to watch. I think Dave Aranda will have a good defensive game plan. Going back to the special teams thing, I think the kick returns, punt returns game specifically, field goals aside, if you can get some short fields because of that, Baylor has advantages in kick returns, punt returns being number 2 in kick returns, number 1 in punt returns, yards per return average, versus Iowa State's ranking 13th and 9th in coverage. if you can find short fields, it's going to help your offense tremendously. And then on top of that, and I don't know exactly Iowa State's, I think you can go back to this. I haven't seen all 15 or all of their punts on tape, but they rank 15th in punting average at 39, while Baylor ranks first in 53. So those hidden yardage, if you expect this game to be close and you can find those hidden yardages, if you can start drives at the 50-yard line on occasion because of these things, that's the upper hand to Baylor, because Iowa State wants you to go long fields entirely throughout the game. So if you can sneak out a few of those and sneak in some field goals, some short field goals, even if it is Iowa State's good in the red zone, that's where Baylor's going to have to figure out ways to win and then ultimately get the win if they win those circumstances.
And Josh Cameron has just been phenomenal in punt return. Feels like every game he's breaking a pretty big one, and that's been huge for Baylor so far this year. Jamal Bell, of course, with the kick return touchdown was great too. He had another big one against BYU that got called back for holding. And so, there's definitely a little bit of an advantage there and something to pay attention to. You got to be able to win on the margins when you go on the road. These games are so close, winning the special teams margin, winning the penalty margin, winning the turnover battle, like all of those things Baylor needs to try to do in this game, because they're the underdog. I mean, they're a 2-touchdown underdog for a reason.
13 and a half, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of points. And I think that just is a sign that there's not a lot of confidence that Baylor's going to be able to do that, because they really haven't done that all year, winning those margins, winning those things that can flip a game. But I also think, this team's been really competitive. And so to think that they're just going to show up and lose by 14 points just right off the bat is rather interesting to me. We're going to predict this game later in the week. I'm not going to predict Baylor to win this game. I do think Iowa State's going to win this one, but I think that in general, this game will still be close. It's another Big 12 game. It's another game that Baylor's very much prepared for, that Baylor needs to win. Like, one team has a lot of urgency going into this game. The other team might as well, as they got Big 12 title hopes, but I expect to see a Baylor team that's very prepared and very focused, despite the fact that, when you look at this game, you look at these two teams, you go, wow, this doesn't really feel like a very good matchup for Baylor. I still think that effort and that physicality, if it does show up on the road like it has a few times for Baylor so far this year, then they might be able to keep this one close, and maybe those margins end up mattering at the end.
Yeah, you got to be in a position for those particular areas of the game to matter. If you're returning punts and kicking field goals and you're doing those things, but you're getting beat by 24 points early in the game by halftime, 14-0, like, those things don't matter nearly as much. You got to score touchdowns. You don't have to worry about field position. You just got to go score the football. So, all right, Baylor family, that's going to do it for today's episode of Inside Baylor Sports, the official daily podcast of Baylor Athletics. Thanks to each of you, including any Iowa State fans tuning in, for listening. For Grayson Grunhafer, I'm Colt Barber. Have a great Tuesday, and sick 'em Bears.